Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. We'd love to know where you're listening from and how you heard about today's webinar. You can enter that into the polls on the left of the screen. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, October 18th at 4 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We'll be hearing from Catherine Grant, who will be giving a presentation entitled Getting the Most from Family Search, Family Tree, the introduction to the introduction to the person page. Catherine Grant, over the next couple of months, will be updating us on the new family search updates, including the person tree and some other features in family search that have recently undergone updates and reformatting. And we are also doing some more things with our webinar website page. Unfortunately, our last webinar with Simone Russell on Facebook and family history wasn't able to be recorded. There was a mishap with the internet connection, and that webinar did not get recorded. However, we will post a written version of that webinar so that you have all of the information. And if you're interested in making your own Facebook family history blog, there will be a tutorial for that. So today we're hearing from James Tanner. He's giving a presentation entitled Learning to Read Old Handwriting. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He's received a Juris Doctor's degree in law from Arizona State University and has worked 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogy research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving a family history mission in Maryland. He's a co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. So as we get the presentation all set up, I'll just bring your attention over to the insights and comment box. If you have any audio problems, if you can't hear the speaker or the host, please type into that box and I'll help you as best as I can. And if you have any questions, if you could wait to the end, we will answer those at the end of the presentation. And I think that's everything. If James is ready, we'll start the webinar.
I'm here. I hope you can hear me. I'm glad to be here for the BYU Family History Library. We're obviously doing this from the remote location of Annapolis, Maryland, where we are serving a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Family Search at the Maryland State Archives. And a lot of the examples that I'm going to talk about today from the handwriting are coming from the documents that we have handled. Some of them will not. That's an interesting way to put it. Some of them are even older than the documents than we can get here at the archive. So we're going to let's go ahead with getting started here. First of all, when you start the study of old handwriting, the study is called paleography. There's an actual way of studying, a way of learning, a profession of being a paleographer, a person who studies old handwriting and deciphers old handwriting. Usually they're associated with either anthropology or with the English departments and and sometimes in the history department. There's lots of different vocations and avocations out there, professions that would need to have some interest in old documents. You don't have to have a very old document to make it handwriting. Most of us who are of a certain age can certainly recall having almost everything we did written on handwritten, letters and everything else. The electronics are making great changes in the way that people communicate, and one of those is a virtual elimination of handwriting. And especially there's kind of a large controversy going on in the schools today about whether or not to even teach handwriting to children. And there's advocates who say that learning handwriting is necessary for proper intellectual growth, and there's others who simply say teach them how to use computers and how to use keyboards, because that's where they're going to spend most of their time. So, but as genealogists, and when we're involved in genealogy, we're obviously faced with the task of deciphering a lot of records that have been preserved and are digitized presently or not, or when you go into an archive or a museum or wherever you're looking for research for libraries, you're going to find a lot of documents and a lot of records that have been were completely in handwriting. And that's what we've been dealing with for the past year here in Annapolis at the Maryland State Archives. The records, it's been interesting to watch the way that the records change over time. We have records back into the 1700s that we've handled, and up to including up into the 1900s. And we've seen that in the late 1900s, beginning around 1880, 1890, a very few documents begin to be typewritten, but by 1922 or 1920s, probably about half of the records are typewritten. But it isn't until almost very, very recently that individual records from individuals living in their, at home who were not associated with businesses were able to afford or use any kind of a typewritten documents. Typewriters, although very common, were not often used for personal invitation. For example, if in the days of my parents, if my mother had, if you had sent an invitation for a formal event such as a wedding invitation, and it was typewritten, she would probably have a fit and fall in it. So basically, there's been a tremendous change, and one of those changes means that learning how to read this old handwriting is not something that people can just look at and say, "Oh, I know how to read that." It is actually an acquired skill. You have to know how to do it. Okay, so let's get into it a little bit. And we're going to start with some very old and then come up to some modern handwriting, just to give some ideas of the kinds of changes that there have been. This is a style of handwriting, handwritten documents, that was common for many hundreds and hundreds of years, and is mostly associated with what we would call the old Middle Ages and before the Middle Ages, what we would also refer to as the Dark Ages. So this is the early, most early European handwriting, and we're not going to talk about handwriting in around the world, for example. That's another big challenge. But there's a lot to be learned about this. This particular style of handwriting is called Carolinian minuscule handwriting, and what it is it was actually started by Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, And he never learned how to read or write, but he was a great sponsor of having other people do it. And so he was the one who sort of uh, instigated the idea of having a commonly accepted type of handwriting, and had enough influence that this was the type of writing that was accepted in most of the western part of the Western European countries, including the British Isles and up into the Scandinavian countries to some extent. There's going to be a lot of variations of this, regional and time variations of the way that this worked. But from the 9th to the 12th century, this was what the handwriting looked like. So here's the question that always comes up, and I hear this in genealogy all the time, and I hear people saying, oh, well, I'm going to trace my ancestry back. How far back have you traced your ancestry? Or how far back do you think, I go back to Charlemagne. And we go, well, yeah. And so I'm assuming you know Latin, and I'm also assuming that you know how to read this old handwriting and that you're familiar enough with it to do research in the documents. Obviously, that is not the case, and a very, very small percentage of the people that I have ever met are familiar enough with Latin and with this handwriting to do research. And basically, when people talk about that, all they've done is copy out of some book and linked up to someone that they assumed was their ancestor. But the reality is that to do research back before 1500 is a major, major undertaking. It is learning language, it is learning a lot of vocabulary, and it is learning very difficult methods of writing. Now the next, and here's a page of text in Carolinian, so you can see what it would look like to look at if you look at that. If you want to look at these of examples of this on your own, you can look up Carolinian minuscule. You don't have to look up that. You just put in Carolinian, and it will have there are hundreds, maybe thousands of examples of old medieval text. One of the things that has been digitized a lot on the internet is our ancient documents. Medieval and earlier manuscripts, there are just thousands and thousands of them online. Beautiful colors, all of the old ancient manuscripts are available if you want to go search for them. Good place to start, as I'll mention later, is the British Museum and the British Library, and those places, they're connections for a lot of these old documents. Okay, here's another example of handwriting. You would think this was either earlier or more obscure, but this is actually later handwriting. And this particular form of handwriting is called secretary hand. And the secretary hand was popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's 1500s and the 1600s. And this was very popular all over Europe. This is probably, if there's anything that's harder to read than this, I'm not aware of it. It would have to be in some obscure language or some obscure script that was non-European scripts. Obviously, if there's a challenge in reading any of the languages, like the Eastern languages of Chinese and down through Indonesia and into India and places like that, the scripts there are also a challenge. The same thing happens in each of those, is that you need to learn the language and the ancient language and also the handwriting systems in order to transcribe and to decipher the texts that are there. We'll come back to this document in a second. Some of you might have recognized what it is. If you looked at it carefully, you'd see what it is, and we'll be back to it in just a few minutes. Here's another example of secretary hand. It's particularly difficult In this case, one of the problems with Secretary Hand and with Carolinian, both of those language handwriting styles, is that they don't follow the normal pattern of sentence structure like we do today. There are no periods. There's no capital letters at the beginning of sentences. Spelling is free form. There's no standardized spelling, so it's basically phonetic, and you really do have to know the language to read the text sometimes because it's written out phonetically instead of having a standardized text. Standardization for most spelling did not occur until the 1850s, and so it's very difficult to even get into this and recognize what it has to say. And so if you're doing research back into the 1600s, then this is what you're going to start to run into in the documents that you find. The next thing that you're probably going to see, here's a blow up of it so you can see it a little bit more clearly. If getting it clear makes any difference in your ability to decipher what it's saying. I can pick out words in this. I can understand enough of it to work at it. And if I wanted to decipher this page, I could probably do that. One advantage is knowing some of the languages and Latin languages, and also I'm very fluent in Spanish and can read most of the Romance languages without too much difficulty. And with that and a background in German and also in some of the other languages in Europe, it makes it doable. It's not impossible. It's just a very difficult and time-consuming task to work your way through these documents. I can say this, that if you worked at it for a long time, for years, you would probably be able to sit down and read these documents without too much difficulty. Okay, we're back to this document that I showed originally, and maybe some of you recognized it, and it is William Shakespeare's will. And his signature is down there, and if you look closely, you can see it's signed by William Shakespeare, who, by the way, spelled his own name a number of different ways. This is the next level. There was quite a jump here. Obviously, this looks like what you would expect from if you were to look at the United States Constitution and documents from that time period in the 1870s and the late 1700s and 1800s. This is from 1884, so we've made a big jump forward in time from the Secretary Hand. And this was called Spenserian. And the Spenserian form, or Spenserian hand, is the way they refer to it, this is what was used in commerce and from individuals going back and forth. And so this is something that you're more than likely to run into with with this kind of situation. Suddenly got a PowerPoint thing there. Okay. Let's move in here. This is both the 18th and into the 20th century. Obviously, not too many people had the ability to write as beautifully and as plainly as this particular example. Now, when we're talking about doing a particular type or a particular handwriting hand or form, we are looking at the latest ones, which came into vogue in the middle and end of the 1800s and into the 20th century, into the 1900s, is Palmer method. And the Palmer method took over most of what the handwriting we see in the United States. If your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents would go to school, if they attended a grade school, grade school 1 through kindergarten through eighth grade in any time, they were taught something that was very similar to this, some variation of this particular method, which was extremely popular throughout the United States and in Europe. And so this was what we would see if we were looking at people's handwriting today. And actually, to some extent, this is the handwriting that I learned when I was a child. Not that my handwriting looks anything like this now, but it did look like that at one time. That's what I was taught to try to do. The letters that are most changed for me, for example, are the T's and the Q's and things like that. Those are the ones that really chart, and the F's. And some of my early years, I was called out by teachers as having terrible handwriting, and so I spent a considerable amount of time trying to learn to do handwriting better. And at least now mine is readable to some extent. So whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing, since I don't do very much handwriting at all today, everything I do is on a computer. So what are the challenges that we face when we're trying to do research back in these old documents? First of all, the age. We've all, just the review here shortly has shown that over time, the handwriting has changed considerably, and that old handwriting, every 100 years back in time means an incremental increase in the difficulty of reading the handwriting simply because of the style and because of the type of handwriting that was in vogue at the time that we're doing the research. And the second part of that is the ability of the person doing the handwriting. There are amazingly, the biggest differences, and probably the ones that create the greatest problems, is simply the fact that many people never learned how to write, and when their handwriting is almost is just terrible. We have some pretty good examples coming up here. I'll show you some interesting examples of the handwriting, most of which we've dealt with. Now, here at the archives, what's interesting is we're working here on the digitizing records at the archives. Part of that process is preparing the documents so that they can be digitized. These are court records that have been filed away, and we are unfolding those records for the first time after maybe 100 years or so, or more, 100 or 200 years. And so the major difficulty, and we have to identify what kind of record it is and pick out the names of the people who were, these are all probate records of people who died and their estates were being probated. We have to identify the person who was the dead person. And so for that, from that standpoint, we've had to learn how to read these documents because we have to pick out what they are and who they are. And that has been the biggest challenge. And the biggest challenge of reading the documents has been the varieties of handwriting of individuals who simply could not write. And so that's where we are. And then obviously we need to also think about the language of the text. As I mentioned initially, the oldest texts are all in almost uniformly in Latin, or a combination of Latin and some other language like Latin and German, or Latin and English, or Latin and Old English. And so learning the language would be necessary. You may be able to discern the letters, but it doesn't help you to know the letters if you can't figure out what the language is. So these are all of the kind of fundamental challenges of learning the handwriting. And we have to know everything else in between. So it's not just looking at all of the handwriting. It's also possibly the condition of the document, whether or not there's been damage, whether it's readable, whether the text is too light. All of those kinds of things have an effect on trying to do research in old documents. Any of you or us who have spent time in the libraries looking at microfilm and doing research on microfilm realize that the quality and the of the text of the image is extremely important. Sometimes we do wish we could look at the original documents because we think that they might be better. Digitizing the documents has increased the quality of the images to a great extent, but it is also doesn't help if the document itself is unreadable. And so there's quite a lot of that. So here's an example of a mid-1800s, late 1800s document. And if you look at that carefully, you can see that it's, this is clear. It's not poor handwriting. And, but there are a lot of different things that you need to learn about the difference between P's and F's and S's and all of the different kinds of letters that have evolved and changed in the way that they are formed. One of the things that that comes from handwriting alone and comes from what we call the letter forms is a thing that's associated with old things, usually back into the 17s and early 1800s, and even earlier than that. And it's the ye old, like ye old, and with shop with SHOPPE, and ye with a Y, YE, as ye old curiosity shop, and everybody today reads that as ye. Well, the letter that's there, that's in that letter that is now used as a Y, is a letter. It was called the Thorn, THORN, and it had an E at the end of it, Thorn, and it was a letter in Northern European handwriting, and it had it's the equivalent of TH in our language today. So when it's the ye old, it's actually saying the old. So it's kind of what we've taken a letter that was common back in those early times and turned it into a new word, and then applied it to show old age or quaintness. And so there's lots of things that have happened as a result of the way that people write and the way that the letters were formed. So here we go. As I said just a moment ago, you'll probably learn that the ability of the writer is the most important factor in reading old documents. Obviously, if you find somebody who can write Spencerian or any of the other letters forms and make it beautiful, it's just a pleasure to try to read because the letters are so formed so perfectly. But most of that is not the case. And here is an example. This is an example from Baltimore County, and it's actually from 1813, so it's early 1800s. You can see a date in there if you look at it. If you were to take this text right here, you may think that this would be practically impossible, and I can just say that time and practice and familiarity makes this highly readable. I can read that straight out if I were to do that. The petition of John Hoffman of Baltimore County respectfully showeth, and so forth. In other words, this is just straight text for once you get to the point of being able to read that. There are worse, believe me. Okay, so here's the contrast. Here's a beautiful example of some text from the 1800s. This is 1852 in the Orphans' Court for Baltimore City on the 28th day of May of 1852. And if you can read cursive, then you can possibly you can possibly read this rather easily. You should be able to recognize these letter forms fairly easily. There may be some letters, specific letters, that may give you some trouble, but after spending some time, one of the things that we do here in preparing these documents, when we can't read a name, for example, and we have some difficulty in deciding whether it's spelled one way or another and who the person was, is we go pull up family search, family tree, and do a search for the name that we think it is, and then sometimes we can, then once we see what the name is really supposed to be, because we usually almost always find the name in the database, and in that case we can decipher a lot of words and names that we couldn't otherwise decipher. Now here's the other end of the spectrum. That's give you an idea of this. This is, so what is the name here? It's the estate of, and the first word, and then it says Miller, and then it says a word, and then it says another letter, and then it says Miller. So what is this person's first name? Obviously, it'd be too bad that we can't have everybody guess, and then we would be able to vote on what we think it is. But this, sometimes we have to sit down and do that when we're trying to decipher these documents. We may have to walk around and see if anybody else has ever seen this name before. Okay, so here's the name. Fortunately, in the same set of documents that goes with this particular probate action, his name was reproduced in another place, and this was his name. It's from 1909, and his name is George. So that first word over there is George. And my answer to that is good luck. Okay, so here's another one, example to look at. Think about this. Can you read that name? What is the name there? Is it J. Solon S. Synthicum? Or the difference here is, are they S's or are they L's? And it can be quite a challenge. Now, fortunately, here in Maryland, that first name, the first name actually is Solon, S-O-L-O-N, and it actually is an S. The third letter there is an L. And the reason why that's easy to read is because we have come across this name as a relatively common name here in Maryland, Linthicum. And the first letter is that an I or a J? And that's where you have to try to work at it a little bit as to whether or not you have an I or a J out there. So these are still a little challenges, even after you've had a lot of experience. It's sometimes getting difficult to make a decision as to what this one is. Okay, so this one is another one. This is a date. And so look at the letters. The first one we're going to say is a 1. The next letter, if you imagine it, and if you can fill it in with your imagination, it is actually a 6. And then it says a word, and the word is pretty easy. If we know it's a month, day of a month, then we can go down to the 3. There's only a couple of months that we would worry about, that it would be. And it's obviously May, because it's got to be, it's not hay. We don't have a month called hay. So it's got to be an M. And then it's an A and a Y. And what is the year? Okay. So the year, if you look at that, that's very plain of what it is. It's 1801. And why is it 1801? Because you have a sideways, it's called the lazy 8. It's they write their 8s sideways, and this is endemically common in the early 1800s. up until around 1820, you're going to see almost every 8 in a date particularly written as on its side like this. Okay, so these are some of the little twerks and things that are wrong. So how do you go about reading these, all this old handwriting? Well, first of all, you have to learn how to do cursive. There's no other choice. You just have to know how to do it. And, reading it and writing it are two different skills. You can learn to read it even if you don't know how to write it. So your hands may not be able to form the letters because that's a motor skill that needs to be learned over time. But you can learn how to read it without learning how to write it, but it helps. If you know how to write it, it usually helps to learn how to read it. And today, one of the kind of a not major issue, but one background issue of genealogy is that since lots of the children of the world are not learning how to write in cursive, then there's a problem because most of those old documents are not going to be open and available to their doing research. And what I found, it's very common, commonly found even among my grandchildren, that there's some who have absolutely no idea what cursive is and can't read it. Even a simple, clear cursive, they have no idea about the word forms. These letters do not look like letters to them, so they have a hard time. Even though this is probably the simplest cursive forms that we're going to, you'll probably see. It'd be lovely if everybody wrote this clearly. This is called New American Cursive, and this was introduced in the early part of the 20th century and became the kind of cursive that was common in the schools, along with the Palmer method, which was very influential. And then that evolved into this New American Cursive, which is the latest one that you're likely to see if you're from your parents even, or your grandparents, if they were old enough to have gone to school in the early part of the 1900s or even the mid-1900s. So how do we start? Well, you start the way that a child starts in school. You start by learning handwriting letter guides. And it shows you this is a letter guide, and you've got cursive A, and you have dots there, and you trace the dots. This is what the children do to learn cursive, is write over and over and over again, write the same letters the way that we learned it in school. The same way here, this will give you how to learn how to read the cursive, because this is an example of the letters as how they're written, and so you can use these letter forms as a method for learning to read the language as it is. So one of the best ways to learn how to read the handwriting is to do research in progressively older records. Okay, so the U.S. Census records are a good cross-sectional example of not only individual differences in handwriting, but also the changes in the handwriting over time. We have, particularly in looking and deciphering names, which are one of the major things that we're looking for in genealogy. So you could start with the 1940 census, for example, and then move backwards into the 1930 census. And you'll see differences in the handwriting as you go back 10 years, and then you move your way back through the census records into the 1800s, and then earlier into the 1700s. So you have a good 200 years worth of text examples of handwriting going back, and you can see how the names of your ancestors change over time from the people who have written them down in the census records themselves. You'll also see examples of really good handwriting and you'll see examples of handwriting that is indecipherable, that can't be read at all, and it's just terrible. Okay, so basically, as you go back in time and use more and more records, one of the things that I did is I inherited a huge number of documents from my great-grandmother. It consisted of thousands and thousands of documents, and I transcribed all those. And so spending about 15 years of my life transcribing documents from the 1800s and into the early 1900s was a good foundation for learning how to read old script and recognize the letter forms, even on very bad handwriting. So the summary is that competency and proficiency come from experience. There's just no shortcut here. You can't sit down and say, I have a magic, I'd like to learn this in a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever. It just takes a tremendous amount of exposure to lots of different letter forms and lots of different styles of handwriting to become comfortable in deciphering the handwriting. So this is an interesting task. I guess fortunately for us, we do have some younger people who have come to work at the archives, and they seem to be doing just fine. After a while, they get used to the letter forms, but they're obviously, it's a learning experience to begin the process of doing this. So one way to start is, another way to start, or to start deciphering the text, even if you have a very low ability to recognize them, is to use letter charts. And this one is for Germanic, and this is called black letter, and it was old type and script. So what you have here is on one hand is Roman letters that we call the Roman letters, the ones that we're familiar with in our own day, and then we have the black letter, which is the German script that was printed, the printing script, and the forms of those letters, and then you have next to that the cursive forms. There are a number of these charts that show variations from different areas, from northern Germany, from the northern Germanic states down to the southern states of that. You'll also see variations as you move eastward into Eastern Europe, and then you'll see changes in the letters as you move into far Western Europe and into France and Spain and down into Italy. Here's an example of one kind of chart that you could find, and this is a little bit excessive. This one goes way back. You can find these charts online by searching in Google Images. If you go to images.google.com and put in old handwriting, you'll come up with a lot of these things. If you look for a specific type of handwriting and do some research online, there are thousands and thousands of examples of these. This particular one is one that was created in 1689, comparing all the known alphabets of the world. It's interesting because some of the things that he has collected as alphabets were not alphabets. They were other forms of script like hieroglyphics, which are not an alphabetic language. But that's kind of interesting thing. This is another form that shows you the changes of the form, another chart that you could find that would show the changes of the writing forms from as the time progressed from 1650 to 1757. And so you can see that if you were to encounter what was listed there as an A in 1757, you may mistake it for a U, or the beginning of a W or something of that nature. Also recognizing, as I mentioned, that the language makes a difference, is that the alphabet in German and in Scandinavian countries and in as opposed to English and as opposed to the Romance languages, that their alphabets vary. There are different letters in the alphabet and different total number of letters in the alphabets in all of those countries, going back in time and presently. So those are kinds of things that that you need to take into account as you're learning this. This happens to be Polish, and so this would be helpful in deciphering Old Polish handwriting. And you would need, of course, to extend this up into the 1800s and 1900s. Here's an example of some old handwriting. And the first thing you need to do is try to identify the type of document that it is. That becomes one of the major issues. As recently as today, we were looking at a document and trying to identify what kind of a document it was and what it was intending to do, so that we would know how it fit into the probate file that we were working with. So this is kind of the first step of knowing if this was a will or a court document or a private letter or any number of other possibilities of what type of document this would be. And that then helps because that helps you to learn the style of writing, as well as the vocabulary that might be contained in this particular document. This happens to be parish chest records of All Hallows Barking in London in 1628 to 1669. And it's like an accounting record. So the first step in deciphering this old text is to study the document and try to read some of the words. Now, in this case, the dates and the letter and the place names and some of those other things and some of the common words might be readable. And so, as you look at it, it may be that the meaning of the whole document might not be apparent, but there may be a few words that you can pick out or that you think you can read, and you may be able to establish what those words are. So my suggestion is, when you start working on a document like this, that you work on it for a while and then put it away. So my way of doing this was to look at it and study it and try to figure out the words for an hour, half an hour or so. Any longer periods of time, usually you start to get bleary-eyed and start doing the same things again and get very frustrated. So I would work on it for a short period of time, and then I would put it away, and then I would come back. And I would do this every day. I would work on it for half an hour on a letter or something that I could not read at all. I would simply read it through, pick up all the words I knew, try to figure out what it said, and then try to figure out the letters and words that I could not identify. Then I'd put it down, come back to it the next day, put it down, come back to it the next day. After about a week or a week or two of looking at the document, letters and words would just start to jump out. And it may be that there would be a few words that would still be very poorly written that I could not read and did not work out the continuity. And otherwise, it was the process of doing it that way, of doing it in small increments over a period of time, let my mind work on it and let become accustomed to the letter forms. And so that was a way of being able to decipher many of the documents. And obviously, once I had deciphered a document from that time period, then it was much easier on the next document and on the next document, until finally I was reading almost all of the words, unless it was very poorly written or reproduced. So if you come back to the document and study it every day for a period of time, you can make Now, another way to do that is to make lists of the letters that you can identify and that you know about, and then go into the letter, look up the words and things that you don't know. You have to understand that not only it may be written in English, but the English may not make a bit of sense. The words may not seem to might as well be written in a different language because of the changes in the meanings and the uses of words in English over time. There's a vast difference between Middle English and modern English and postmodern English like we use today. Okay, so you just keep repeating that process over and over again on the same document until you begin to see how that document, what that document might mean. But if you've identified the document, another thing that's important is to find, if you can find online similar documents, or maybe even the document you're trying to decipher have already been translated by someone. If you can find an example of the same kind of document that has been transcribed by someone who had gone through this process, that's a great assistance to your learning how to decipher the language. There's also a number of handwriting reference books. This one, Reading Early American Handwriting by Kip Sperry, who's a recently retired professor from Brigham Young University. And this was extremely helpful for me to get started in deciphering the old handwriting. Here's another book in a different language, Deciphering Handwriting in German Documents by Roger Meinert. And Roger Meinert is also a professor at Brigham Young University. There's lots of these, not lots, there are some of these books out there that have examples, extensive examples of the handwriting from various years of different countries. And so they're helpful and they're good reference books to have around. There are some classes online. BYU, Brigham Young University, Provo, Utah has online, byu.edu, has a script tutorial. If you type in BYU script tutorial in a search, you'll come right to this, and they have tutorials in English, German, French, Spanish, and Italian, and they're courses that teach all of the letter forms and how to decipher all of this handwriting. This is a good way to get a start, but there's really no substitution for picking up the documents themselves and working with them and making an effort to read the handwriting as you go back in time. It's called the BYU Script Tutorial. Just look that up on Google. There's another script tutorial from the National Archives in Britain, and it's on paleography and teaches you how to read Old English handwriting from the 15 to 1800s with an online tutorial. So this is fairly extensive. Both of these are free, and you can, all of these tutorials in both the BYU and the National Archives in Great Britain are free. This is the British National Archives. Here's another one. This one's from the Folger State Shakespeare Library, and this is not necessarily there's some links here to various ways to begin deciphering the manuscript materials, and also courses from the University of Cambridge, and there are links here to the National Archives, the British Archives, and there's Scottish Archives and other ones that are helpful. So this is Folgerpedia. It's Folger Shakespeare Library here in Washington, D.C. And that's one where you can go to the on-site. This is also a free website. So you just keep working at learning how to read it. There's no shortcut. I don't think they're ever going to write a text for reading old handwriting for dummies or the Idiot's Guide to Old Handwriting. Neither of those is ever going to work. It does take work and it does take time, and but it's worth the effort. And particularly, it's worth the effort back at least to 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 generations of your own family, so that you can read the letters and read the documents, and opens up the world of what was going on back in that time in those time periods. Well, thanks for watching. We encourage you to check out the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. That's where these webinars are being posted. They're also on the BYU Family History Library website, which is part of the byu.edu. If you look for BYU Family History Library online, you will find the website and links to a lot of resources, including the webinars here that have been uploaded. One of the issues in the past has been that in chapels in the buildings of the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there has been a blackout on YouTube, and there still is. But to get around that, the BYU Family History Library is uploading these to their website, so you can actually make use of these webinars and tutorials that have been uploaded. We have almost 400 of these now, and I think planning a whole long list of them back when I get back to Provo, and we're finished with our mission here in Maryland. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer questions. Maren, do we have any questions?
Yes, we had one question from Elaine. She wanted to know if there was a handout or if you would make a handout for this presentation.
The presentation is the handout because it goes online and it becomes available at any time. I have written about this on my blog, my blogs extensively, and there's lots of other materials. There's really nothing. The handout would say just exactly what I just said here. What we are doing, however, is we're uploading these presentations as PDF files with pictures of with the words, each of the slides. With I think we're doing 6 slides on a page or something like that. And so these should be available on the BYU Family History Library website because we'll have a PDF version of the slides. So that's another thing that we've decided to do. Anything else, Maren?
Warren Smith had a comment. He said, wouldn't the writing instruments of the day have a lot of influence on the style of writing being used within a particular society as well?
Yes, that's a good point. Obviously, they didn't have ballpoint pens, and they didn't have markers like we have today, and all of those different ways of writing. Generally speaking, there were that metal pens were invented only at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. Before that, almost universally, they used either a reed or a quill from a variety of different birds, usually turkeys or chickens or ducks or geese or something like that, that had a rather large quill. So the letter forms that you see are to some extent determined by the writing instrument, but it's basically the biggest problem that I've seen in that regard is when I was looking at parish registers, and the one that sticks in my mind is in Puerto Rico. We're doing research, and the priest who had recorded all of the parish registers kept running out of ink, and so the letters would be very dark, and then over a period of time they would get lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter until they were almost indecipherable, and then apparently you'd buy some new ink and start over again being dark. So there's all sorts of factors that affect how easy, you might say, or how any ability to read it at all sometimes is determined by that. Any other questions? Hopefully I've answered that.
It looks like we don't have any right now, but I see that some people, they're just saying thank you.
Oh,
So
okay.
I think everybody had their questions answered. So we'll just close up, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for spending your time learning more about handwriting. So we hope that that if you want to access this webinar again, there will be a recording. I'll post that tomorrow on Friday. And we hope that you can join us next week for Catherine Grant's presentation on the Family Search Family Tree person page. There's also some polls on the left side of the screen. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you have any other comments, suggestions, or questions, you can email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. And thank you so much. And just as James was saying, this will be posted on our website as well. So if you'd like to view it not on YouTube, that would be the place to go. And we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.